and we will commence. Welcome everyone to our event at the Institute for Greater Europe, dealing with next gen security, securing tomorrow for the youth of today. Now, my name is Philippe. I'm the chair of the Institute for Greater Europe, and I'm very proud and happy to be able to introduce all our wonderful speakers today, and for all of our participants watching, and for those watching the recording later. Now, this panel was actually formulated quite a few months ago when we thought for the Munich Security Conference, some of the ideas about the discussion of how youth can get involved in security. Now, through dialogue with them, we came up with the idea of making it a bit more broader and making it our own sui generis event. And so we're very happy to have a roundtable today with three wonderful speakers: Alexandra Machsteiner, Håkan Top, and Emma Hakala. I hope the pronunciations are okay. As I mentioned before, I'm not very good with these names, but I try my best. So I will give a small introduction to each of our speakers and to Oliver and Adith, who will be taking the moderation for this wonderful event, and lead it over to them. And we look forward to all of your wonderful questions and engagement in today's webinar. So Alexandra Machsteiner is a researcher at the SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, focusing on the collection and analysis of data on military spending and the arms industry, one of the most important projects that SIPRI deals with some of the areas of research, including the international presence of arms company and, of course, the financial value of arms exports, as well as trends in the US and German military expenditure. She spends, as we mentioned, some of her time also between Munich, so she has a great connection to both the areas and in Germany. Håkan Top, PhD, is an accomplished water governance and policy strategist and specialist with over 20 years hands-on experience with the catalyst and facilitation of water resources and service policy development and implementation in emerging and low-income economies in Africa and Asia at SIWI, who, if I'm not wrong, is the Stockholm International Water Institute. Almost said Swedish International Water Institute, but of course Stockholm, they're based. And last but by no means least, we have Emma Hakala at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. She has an expertise in a broad range of subjects, including climate security, environmental security, and Western Balkan and post-conflict cooperation. So we hope with these three wonderful speakers, we'll be able to get the different angles of next-gen security, looking at both what is to come in the issues of future security, and of course, how we can put our best foot forward. And joining us from the Institute here, we have Oliver Laurie, who is a final year languages student at the University of Leeds, currently writing for the Institute and focusing on themes such as political theory, German studies, and the impact of digitalization on contemporary society. And last but by no means least, we have Adith. And again, for pronunciation, I mean, this is why Adith and I just go by Addy most of the time. He's an undergraduate student at the University of Edinburgh, where he's currently pursuing a Master of Arts in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, originally from the US, and having served as a youth ambassador to Germany, in fact, for the US State Department. He focuses quite heavily on political economy of development, politics of time, and international security. And he also serves as our desk officer for the Global Political Economy Bureau. Now, with that, I now yield over to Oliver and Addy for today's wonderful panel. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Philippe, for the introductions. Now we're going to go straight into hearing the opening remarks from our panel. We've got a little bit of leeway here, but if I could ask the panelists to stick to about 5 minutes per opening remark, that'd be great, just so that we have enough time for the roundtable and the Q&A later. So who wants to go first? Alexandra, are you okay to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and Philippe for the kind introduction. Really thrilled to be here. It's always important to bring these issues to young leaders like yourself. And let me just say, I think it's wonderful that we have many different aspects of security represented here, not just the hard security, but following a more comprehensive definition of the term. So, definitely great thinking. I'll try to keep my opening remarks as brief as possible. I obviously want to hear from my wonderful fellow panelists, and then later on from all of you, should you have any questions. So, like Philippe said, I work for the SIPRI Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program. where we spend much of our time maintaining two very large databases, one on global military spending and another on the revenue of the arms industry. So, we're kind of able to tackle this issue of armament, both from the demand side, how much do governments spend on weapons, which is by no means all of military spending. Military spending, encompasses a bit more than that, but let's focus on weapons for now. And then, also tackling the issue from the supply side. So, companies producing and selling the weapons. And, through our study of these data points, we see that on the military spending side, there has been an increasing trend since about 2014. And every year since, it's been growing. In 2020, which is the most recent year for which we have data, global military spending almost hit $2 trillion. So we're almost at that very monumental mark. And on the arms production side, that trend is also reflected in the fact that that revenue figures of the arms industry are growing. We look at the world's 100 largest companies, and just they alone, they made over $500 billion in revenue in 2020. And that's actually quite a bit more than it was a decade ago. So, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but what I'm trying to articulate is that, we really do find ourselves in a period of armament, more military spending, more arms procurement, and some might say that we have entered a new arms race, and that can come with many destabilizing effects. What's also really interesting about our work is that we're able to observe changing priorities in the procurement of military systems. For now, countries still spend most of their money, and companies make most of their money through conventional systems, meaning tanks, naval ships, rifles, missiles, that sort of thing. And that also makes up for most of the arms exports, but we're beginning to see a shift towards what we call emerging military technologies. So think cyber, think artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, space systems. So, there's definitely a new focus on that. To give you an example, just a couple of days ago, the US Department of Defense, the Pentagon, released its new budget request for 2023. And that actually has the largest the largest fund allocated to research and development ever in the history of the US. And with the stated intention of securing America's technological advantage over its strategic rivals, most prominently Russia and China. The budget also massively increases funding for the US Space Force. So we definitely see that these new priorities are beginning to be reflected in the actual budget figures. And I think as more money is being poured into these technologies, and as they're being rolled out, military doctrines are also being adapted to this new reality. And we already see examples of that. There are now reports that hypersonic missiles were used by Russia in Ukraine. So that would fall under the umbrella term of emerging military technologies. And I really don't think that it's going to stop there. We might find ourselves soon in a situation where artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, and wars will one day be fought with lethal autonomous weapons that are by themselves able to identify, target, and engage threats. So then the pressing issue becomes, how do we regulate these emerging technologies? How do we ensure that international humanitarian law is respected as warfare enters these new domains, be it the space domain, be it the cyber domain? And there are already many brilliant people around the entire world who are working on this. But I think it's important that we create a broader sense of awareness about these issues and all of the problems that could come with the proliferation of these technologies. And so that's why, I think panels like these are a great opportunity to do just that. And I kept it broad in my opening remarks, but if you want me to dive deeper into any one of those issues that I mentioned, please feel free to ask questions during the Q&A session. So with that, it's my opening remarks. And yeah, I hand it back to you, Oliver.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was just about 5 minutes. Very good start. Let's see if we can keep that track record running. So next, Håkan, are you okay to go next?
Sure.
Great, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Happy to. Yeah, I think first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to this. I think it's really interesting, also as we heard here, to discuss, I think, conflict and peace from just different perspectives, which I think is really useful and very much needed, and that we need to see on these issues in very dynamic ways. I think also in how we can find solutions on how we can go towards more cooperation. I think also, I mean, I view water sustainability, it's very much an intergenerational issue. I mean, we say also water, it's something that you have very much like seasonal variations, interseasonal variations, but I think here also we need to look at water sustainability also in an intergenerational perspective. So we shouldn't deny future generations to also be able to have access to clean water and also the fair amount of water. What I will speak on a bit is on water security. I think also touch a little bit on water as a source of conflict and cooperation. But I think first of all, why on Earth's name is water important? How come? Water is one of the SDGs. It's SDG 6 on water and sanitation for all. Water is this very precious natural resource that cuts across almost all aspects of our lives, it cuts across nature, it cuts across different types of economic sectors. So it's really this type of natural resource that's critical for so many parts of both human and life in nature. What we're witnessing, and this is something we've seen for quite a long time, an increasing number of countries are facing mounting water challenges. I think of social, financial, and environmental risks, very much related to too little water, too much, or too polluted waters. Too much in the sense of floodings, for example. And I think this is something we've seen more and more of in Europe, for example, in the past 10 to 15 years. And it's something that really impacts both human security, but of course also more the economic security of countries. We also know that some 40% of the world's population currently lives in what can be called as water-stressed river basins. We can also clearly see that the demand for water is very much on the rise. OECD suggests that some 55% will be the increasing water demand between 2000 and 2050. It's not so much in Europe, actually. I think the biggest emerging demand comes more from developing countries, and particularly from the manufacturing industry. So that they will see a great demand. Also, the energy sector will demand a lot of water in the future. Then, of course, water for food production will remain high demand for that. But actually in Europe, it's projected that demand will actually be a bit less the coming years for producing food. We also know the challenges on delivering water services of good quality. So there's still like close to 1 billion people that don't have access to clean water for drinking, for example. If we look at basic sanitation, the figures are much worse even, and as many as 120 countries are not really on track to meet the SDG sanitation target. So I think here, I mean, we have a number of different types of water challenges, and of course, climate change will add extra stress and vulnerability to water and its different uses. It's also something that can drive, for example, migration. In 2016, some close to 25 million people were, for example, displaced due to these more weather-related disasters. Most of them related to floods and storms of different sorts, also drought. So I think here that water demands and challenges on sharing water are rather on the increase, and very much being driven by population growth, economic development, urbanization, also comes with changing lifestyles that are more water demanding, and also climate change, which then can very much change the supply of water, basically when it rains. So I think here, if we look at the resource as such, it really means that water security is getting increasingly challenged. When we say water security, we include human security, economic, for example, linked to food security, energy security, and also very much related to floods and droughts. We also need to manage our water in a good way, so that we mitigate floods and droughts in the best way we can. I think then a little bit to try to round off here a bit and save something for the discussion too. That already in the 1990s, Boutros Ghali, former Egyptian Secretary General of the UN, he said that the next world war will be on water. But luckily, if we actually look at this, so far there has been no direct water wars, and there's been plenty of research going into this. In fact, there are close to 300 multilateral and bilateral agreements on international water cooperation. So I think in that sense, we can also rather view water not only from the conflict perspective, but also something that can drive cooperation between countries and different stakeholder groups. Just finally, so even though we haven't witnessed any direct water wars, it is, however, a situation where we increasingly see water being used as a chip in bigger conflicts, for example. So this is something we're witnessing now, and even now in the war between Ukraine and Russia. So it's being played out there, where Russia has been destroying some water dams in Ukraine. It's something that has played out a lot in the Israeli-Palestine conflict, for example, and also in so many other places around the world, and where then water is really used as a bargaining chip or something you use as a weapon to kind of weaken your opponent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Håkan. That was a little bit over 5 minutes, but we'll allow you to stay. No,
sorry for that.
Yeah, we'll allow it. Don't worry. I'm not going to kick you out just yet.
No,
but thank you. That was a lot of very interesting stuff and material that we will get into in the roundtable when we come to it. But with no time to lose, we'll move on to Emma. Firstly, lovely to meet you. Emma, thank you for coming. I realized that there are a couple of technical difficulties, but if you'd like to proceed with your opening remarks, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and sorry again about the I don't know what happened with my trying to join the meeting, but anyway, I should also note that now after 2 years of successfully evading COVID, I finally have it. So if I have some problems with my voice or something, or if I pass out unexpectedly, that shouldn't happen, but at least then you'll know why that is. Anyway.
So as was mentioned, my research interest is climate security and also maybe the geopolitics of climate change. And I think that this is a topic that even though now we are kind of seeing this return of this very traditional sort of military oriented security to some extent on the world stage, it still hasn't kind of replaced or sort of pushed out the climate issues, and at the very least it shouldn't, obviously, because climate change is still very much happening. And I would also argue that it's maybe one element that is visible in the current war and Russia's attack to Ukraine, even though it's obviously not the main reason or the sort of a major factor in that sense, but obviously the energy transition that Europe at least is trying to go through quite fastly, and the sort of threats that it poses to Russia is an element in the setting of the war, if you will. And I think it's also important to observe that we are probably, unfortunately, entering a time where we have these simultaneous crises ongoing increasingly, and where we also have to deal with and somehow address very difficult issues like climate mitigation, but at the same time we should be able to somehow prepare for and maybe prevent other security threats at the same time. And that's not going to be easy, and we maybe have to adopt a new kind of mindset to security, where we can focus on a multitude of issues and see their interlinkages also. But I thought that just briefly, in order to somehow outline what climate security is, I would just present this sort of framework in which I tend to think about the security impacts of climate change. So I sort of see climate security as this sort of three-level framework, in a way, where you have direct impacts, cascading impacts, and transition impacts. And the direct impacts are the ones that are maybe the most sort of traditional, like all kinds of floods and storms and these sort of natural disasters that affect people's security and well-being directly. And these tend to also be quite local, which maybe is one reason why we somehow have still tended to consider climate security in a rather local context. But I would actually argue that an increasingly significant issue that we have to think about are these cascading impacts, which are ones where the environmental impacts are somehow combined with socioeconomic or political or even geopolitical factors, and they sort of become these chains of events that somehow also go across national boundaries and can be very difficult to then predict and somehow prepare for. So these would be issues like conflicts and forced migration and supply chains disruptions and maybe also increasing inequality around the globe and all kinds of issues like that. And these tend to be quite complex. And then thirdly, we still have the transition impacts, which are associated with the mitigation and to some extent the adaptation to climate change. And this is not to say that we shouldn't be doing climate mitigation. We have to be doing it very efficiently. But now that we are at the point where the actions that we have to take in order to mitigate climate change are quite huge and also quite structural at the sort of systemic level of the society, they will very likely also have some kinds of effects on our security. And the question then is how well and carefully we plan the measures that we take in order to prevent these unwanted consequences. And these transition impacts are both sort of local or national. So, for example, this increasing polarization in politics concerning, for example, energy price rises or things like that. or then they can be international, like this sort of winners and losers between different countries that are either big fossil fuel producers, which will likely lose out to some extent, and then countries that are actually have a lot of potential in sustainable energy production. And this maybe is the dynamic that I was referring to that we are seeing with the Russian attack to some extent. But I think I will actually end there and leave or expect the discussion. And yeah, I hope you got something out of that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. Thank you to the other two panelists as well. I hope that gave you a bit of an insight into our guests, what might be discussed today, what will come in the Q&A and the roundtable. But anyway, moving on, I'll be back for the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Adi to introduce and moderate the roundtable. Adi, take it away.
Thanks very much, Ollie. So during this roundtable, we've prepared a handful of questions that we'll direct towards the panel as a whole. And then what we'll go ahead and do is go the reverse order of how we did the opening remarks. So we'll kind of direct these questions starting with Emma, and then Håkan, and then Alexandra. So to get us started off, during those opening remarks, we had got a sense of these different burgeoning security threats that promise to pose an issue for the next and future generations, if not already. But I wonder how, in your own research, how has Europe prioritized these sorts of threats in response? The major question policymaking and agenda setting is, how do we allocate resources, if not money, time, to resolving these various issues? So how has Europe prioritized these different threats? And do you see any places where change is imperative? If we could start with Emma on climate.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's a kind of a twofold answer, I think. I mean, of course, to some extent, the EU and Europe is seen as some kind of a climate leader on a global level. And Europe has, of course, been, especially in the recent years, it's been investing a lot on energy transition and sort of formulating these policies like the what is it called? The European Green Deal. Sorry, somehow my mind was blocked for a moment. And so in a way, it's become like one of these sort of major kind of topics for the EU to be promoting energy transition and to move into more sustainable methods of production and consumption in general. So in terms of mitigating climate change, I think that in a way it is at least a huge policy priority for the EU. But then of course you can criticize to a great extent what is actually being done, and especially then by the time that you get to the country level or member state level, then whether the actions are actually taken that should be taken and so on. And then if we think about the kind of threats of climate security, I think that still is maybe not such clearly developed discussion at the European level. So there is some sort of recognition, and quite a great extent of recognition even of the security impacts of climate change. And climate change is, for example, a big factor in the global strategy of the EU. But I would say that these sort of exact measures or ways in which this issue should be tackled are still a bit sort of unclear. Now it's maybe coming increasingly to some strategies, and there have been sort of these kinds of plans about how to integrate climate security, for example, into these the common security and defense policy, and into, for example, the European civil crisis management missions and so on. But there seems to be this sort of like central framework of how to go about this seems to be lacking a little bit. So there is still a lot to be done, but I have hope in that sense that it's an emerging discussion.
Thank you very much, Emma. And Håkan, you mentioned water cooperation. So I'll pose the same question to you. And I wonder whether, adding on top of that, whether you see those avenues of water cooperation also being realized on the European level, not just the threat that water sustainability and security pose, but whether cooperation is also being realized and discussed at the EU and also at the country level.
For sure, yeah. I think there, and I think if we look within the European Union, I mean, there are several water frameworks being developed, and I think this has been the case for quite many years. There is the EU Framework Directive on Water, for example. So that really goes into how countries should kind of manage their resources. Then, of course, countries can choose to do that with different type of institutional setups, of course. So I think this is something that EU is really looking at. I think many countries are really struggling how to really resolve it in a more practical way. And where I would say that progress is quite uneven if one starts to look in the countries. There's one example of a huge investment challenge which plays out now, not only in Europe, but I would say in all, at least developed countries, including US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc., is that the infrastructure for drinking water supply and sanitation is really in dire need for kind of being replaced by new infrastructure. So these are like gigantic investments that are required. Most countries, they are not prepared for this. They have been postponing this now for many years. I know, for example, in my own country, many municipalities now, they really have to increase the prices on drinking water and sanitation quite significantly, actually. So it's quite shocking for consumers. So I think this is something that we will see much more of, actually. And which I think can a little bit upset some like social cohesion, stability, and especially it will hit lower income groups the most, I think, when prices are being hiked. I think then in general, I mean, it's fair to say that the water sector is underfinanced. I think also if we look at water resources management, so that it's very much to protect the source of water. And then we use water for different purposes. But also here, I mean, I think the nature of water many times, because it is a public good, it's also an economic good. So there are different dynamics when it comes to water, but the fact that it's also a public good makes it very difficult to develop sustainable financing models. So it's very difficult to implement, for example, polluters pays principles when it comes to water pollution. Also when it comes to managing the resource, when it comes to flood protection, for example. I mean, there are very few companies that would invest in that straight up because there are no kind of short-term capital gains in that, and that's how it works. So I think in that sense, I mean, we're also looking at raising financing then through, I think through tariffs and taxes. I think those would be the main ways on how to do that. What I can see then for many developing countries, it's I think for them it's basically investing in infrastructure in the first place. So and there you also have quite an extreme underfinancing of the sector. And I can also see that you have, and this also links back to financing, because you have many challenges of coordination between sectors. A lot of policy misalignments. For example, you would have agriculture having one set of policies, really driving water use for food production. At the same time, you have the Ministry of Environment that would like to implement environmental flow concept, for example. But already all the water has been allocated or even over allocated. And you don't really have a system on reallocating between sectors in that way. At the same time as agriculture normally comes with a very strong lobby and being very unwilling to pay for water. I just stopped there. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And for Alexandra, the same question. So how do you see Europe prioritizing these emerging military technologies that you mentioned? You also written before on the Europeanization of defense and maybe a growing disillusionment with transatlantic relations. So I wonder here, this question notwithstanding, whether you think that's kind of still an issue that needs more discussion, that's receiving proper attention.
Absolutely. So, you know, I'm kind of coming at this from a slightly more hard security perspective. And in that realm, you know, we've seen priorities changing over the past 20 years or so, quite heavily actually. During the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, for example, where, you know, those were obviously led by the US, but many European partners were involved. The focus was on counterinsurgency strategy, you know, winning hearts and minds, tackling terrorist organizations, that sort of thing. And then, you know, in 2014, we saw the annexation of Crimea, and I'm sure you've all heard this term, hybrid warfare, became all the rage. So that's a combination of irregular warfare and so-called influencing methods. Think foreign election interference or disinformation campaigns. So, you know, that really was all that anyone talked about for quite a while. And now with the current war in Ukraine, you know, it shows us that conventional warfare might not be quite as dead as we thought that it was. You know, we see pictures of convoys of tanks. There are reports of missile strikes. There are amphibious assaults. All of these hallmarks of conventional warfare. But at the same time, you know, there is a threat of the use of nuclear weapons. You know, Russia raised the alert level of its strategic forces. Strategic forces is usually just a different word for nuclear forces. So that kind of brings us to the non-conventional realm, and then also the emerging technologies, like I mentioned before. You know, now we see advancements in cyber and AI and quantum technologies, all of which you know, are beginning to change priorities in defense planning. And I think as we've heard from the other panelists, to kind of compound the difficulty of setting priorities, you know, many states are now adopting a more comprehensive definition of security. So it's not just about state security anymore. It's not just about military security, but it's about human security. That, you know, that includes food, health, water security, climate security, economic security. You know, all of these different factors. And you know, that's a promising development, but you know, it makes the decision even harder what to prioritize. So, you know, kind of when I was preparing for this question, I thought about what I want Europe to prioritize at the moment. You mentioned the paper that I wrote a couple of years ago on the European defense integration and, you know, the future of transatlantic relations. That was written during the Trump administration, so, you know, it was a bit of a different tone. Europe was kind of seeing the rise of this debate around strategic autonomy, so being able to defend ourselves without relying on US support. You know, that may have well been the case under the Trump administration. Trump was notoriously antagonistic towards Europe. Now, luckily, with the Biden administration in place, you know, we now have a transatlanticist back in the White House, and you know, this is my personal opinion. I think that Europe is very lucky, particularly during this difficult time with the war in Ukraine, that it's Biden and not Trump in the White House. So, you know, I think maybe the urgency of the strategic autonomy debate might have fizzled down a bit. That doesn't mean to say that it's not still very timely. So I think From the hard security perspective, one thing that Europe should definitely prioritize is setting up its conventional forces in a way that is complementary and interoperable, both within the NATO alliance and within the European Union. European security and defense, it's inherently multilateral, both because of NATO's Article 5 and because of the Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty. That's kind of, the EU's version of this mutual defense clause. So all of that means that we need to be able to fight together. That's also good news for the taxpayers, because these joint defense, this joint defense cooperation can actually save money if it is done right. I think also, I kind of hinted at this in my opening remarks. Europe, it already does this, but it needs to do it more. There needs to be investment of diplomatic and bureaucratic resources into the regulation of the use of emerging technologies. I really fear what happens if we don't find a global consensus on the use of lethal autonomous weapons. That's a really scary reality, and I don't even want to think about that. Maybe a couple of other things to mention as well that I would like to see prioritized. We need to invest in the protection of our democracies. It's by far, the most important good that we have. And we've seen it come under attack again and again, both by internal and external actors over the past couple of years. So that needs to be a priority. We need to prioritize development assistance. Germany actually, when the new coalition was formed back in December, they had this great policy of wanting to invest 3% of GDP into defense, development, and diplomacy. And it was kind of this way of having an integrated approach, and kind of maybe going against the rigidity of NATO's 2% of GDP target. We don't know what's going to happen to that now that Germany has decided to boost military spending by 100 billion euros. But it kind of speaks to this fact that we are not insulated from crises elsewhere. We have to invest in the human security of our neighbors, and that doesn't just benefit them, it benefits us as well. And last but not least, I think Emma, you kind of hinted at this. I really want to see Europe prioritizing energy security. We imposed sanctions on Russia, but we're still paying millions of euros every single day to get oil and gas from them. We're really way too dependent. And that money then goes into financing Russia's war machine. So that money would be much better spent on green infrastructure and green energy sources here at home in Europe. So I think that really needs to be a focus. I know I've taken up way too much time, but this is such an interesting topic. I promise to hold my other answers a bit shorter. But yeah, back to you.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. I appreciate that. So this time we'll go ahead and start with Håkan. Obviously, that particular question notwithstanding, all of your answers hinted at the fact that a lot of these threats are not unique to Europe. And in fact, the inclusion and consideration of other countries complicates the picture quite a bit in terms of resolving a lot of these threats and questions. So I wonder, to what scale do you think international cooperation is necessary? Do you think that the steps that we've made are pointing in the right direction? Do you think there have been any retractions? And Håkan, you talked a lot about water cooperation. So maybe a few examples of how those have been realized at that scale would be helpful as well.
Sure, yeah. No, I think first of all, I think it's clear that not enough is being done. I think if we look at the actual implementation rate of SDG 6, for example, and many other SDGs too, of course, it's clear that many countries will miss completely the targets by 2030. So it's very clear that I think the international community has not really stepped up when it comes to financing, for example. I think this is very clear if we look at when it comes to climate change agenda, for example. So I think they're still like far away from what they have promised. and even more so when it comes to adaptation measures and linked to climate change. So I think in that sense, I mean, there is a lot of talk and much less action. So I think now what the international community really need to do, and do it quickly, is really to see how they can accelerate SDG implementation. So actually now, and this is something we are a bit engaged in, there will be the United Nations Water Conference 2023. It's a conference meant to be a midterm review of the international water decade, and we are in the midst of that next year. But that serves as a very good opportunity to really look at water as one policy area, and what can be done very quickly to actually accelerate the speed of SDG implementation. I think here, I've been mentioning financing a lot. So of course it's about financing and more of it, but I think it's also very much about how current financing is being used. We also know that in many emerging and developing economies and some other countries too, of course, the developed world, we know, for example, that mismanagement, corruption are very big challenges. So I think there, I mean, as one first step, it's really also to make existing investments much more effective and efficient. And then, of course, also increasing the funding as such and making that available for developing countries. I think a second type of issue is more looking at governance and different types of governance aspects and policy. And I think this is also where water cooperation sits in. And I think here we are very much looking at how can we then improve coordination between different sectors, and I think there are also some good examples around where some countries are really trying to take some steps forward. I know that it's being done within EU, for example, also within the Green Growth Agenda, and really where they're trying to see, sometimes it's called like a nexus approach, and really where you need to see issues of water, energy, food, environment, land. You really need to see this as one holistic entity, and it's like within that you then need to kind of align policies, also where you can also do more multiple regulation, for example. Something that we talk a lot about working on water, we talk about a river basin approach or a catchment-based approach, which basically means that you use the catchment as one administrative unit. So you do very much planning around that catchment geographical unit. And that's also where you kind of strike the balances and between different types of water uses, and how you then divide up your water between different uses, be it irrigation, water for industry, water for drinking, into cities, for example. So I think also here yes, we need to invest more in infrastructure, but we also need to invest much more in improved governance. So that's, I think, always forgotten, and investing in capacities and governance systems, that tends to be a bit not there. So I think that's something also the international community can put more focus on.
Great, thank you, Håkan. Emma, you talked a little bit about when we were discussing Europe, You said that while there seems to be quite ample recognition of the threat that climate security poses, there's maybe not as much discussion regarding particular solutions. So I wonder, on the internet, in an international context, do you think that's still the same? And what steps do you think the community needs to do to move forward and resolve this issue?
Yeah, I think that's an important topic to think about now. And there are several elements to this. And in a way, maybe I should also add that I kind of really like the fact that the EU has increasingly somehow integrated climate issues into their sort of geopolitics, and even sort of talked about the geopolitics of climate change and so on, partly also in an attempt to somehow take advantage of the sort of cooperation and commercial opportunities that there are, but then also kind of, I think, acknowledging the sort of the extent to which climate change is both affecting the kind of the actions of the EU in the world, and then also what the EU has to take into account as it's planning its geopolitical approach and so on. So I would say that first of all, there is what I was kind of already mentioning, that the EU should be doing more is to kind of understand maybe that the sort of local level actions that the EU is taking in terms of crisis management, for example, are actually really crucial from a climate security point of view, because they both present an opportunity to do something at the local level in third countries outside the EU, and then also they can sort of provide this important information and understanding about how these climate dynamics are affecting at the local level, and what kinds of global impacts these might have. So this is why I think that it is so important to integrate climate issues into all kinds of conflict analysis and all kinds of crisis management issues. And I think that still is missing a little bit. But then there is also the other side, in a way, of the, for example, the European Green Deal, which has begun as a kind of a European project. So a lot of the actions that it proposes, for example, are quite sort of Europe-centered. And then, as a kind of an afterthought, maybe somebody realized that actually what happens in the EU has huge implications around the world. And I would say that unfortunately, a lot of the climate actions that we have to take have the potential to create these sort of adverse transition impacts elsewhere in the world. For example, if we increasingly start to use biofuels in our traffic systems, then that might have implications for food security in countries outside the EU and situations like that. But at the same time, while I do think that there is a risk associated with that, I think it's also a huge opportunity for the EU to increase its sort of partnerships with countries around the world, and through that to sort of both increase the understanding of these potential adverse transition impacts, and then to find solutions that will be beneficial both for the mitigation of climate change and also the preparedness for these climate security impacts, both in the EU and in these sort of countries outside the EU. And I think that really has to be a kind of a like the basis of the EU's approach, because otherwise we do run a risk of hurting the rest of the world.
And for finally, last but not least, Alexandra, with regards to emerging military technologies, obviously we discussed Europe, we talked a little bit about the US, but in international context, what threat does this pose? Has the international community come to some sort of consensus with regards to these kind of newer emerging challenges? And where do you give us effectively kind of a status report? Where do we stand now, and what do you think we need to do moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, myself, I kind of focus more on the transatlantic space, but luckily CFRE work itself is very international. So I'm kind of piggybacking off of the work done by my colleagues. But, you know, everything that I've said about emerging technologies, be it cyber, be it AI, be it quantum, you know, that by no means is limited to Europe and North America. You know, we know quite well that China has been investing a lot of money into the development of its hypersonics. You know, also, you know, there are large military spenders in that hemisphere, in that part of the world, be it Australia, be it Japan, be it South Korea, and they're also looking increasingly more into emerging technologies. And you know, to kind of put this into context, the trends that I talked about during my opening remarks of, you know, increasing military expenditure and also the revenues of arms companies growing, those are by no means limited to Europe and the US. You know, I think we're actually seeing growth in military spending in most regions. At least that was the case in 2020. I think the exceptions were like South America and Central Asia. So, you know, again, that has the potential to lead to destabilizing arms races, particularly in the regional context. On the arms production side, on the arms industry side, it's very similar. It's true, most of the very large arms companies are headquartered in the US and Europe, but you know, we're also seeing a massive growth in the Chinese arms industry. You know, the other big players, be it Israel, India, again, South Korea, Japan, all of their large companies are reporting increased revenue. So, you know, all in all taken together, that we see that as a reflection of both heightened tensions and also threat perceptions. How do countries view one another? How do they view their, you know, their security within the region? So that kind of begs the question, what do we do about it? What does the international community do about it? And there's one step that the international community can take as it relates to so-called confidence building measures. You know, that can be anything from sending observers to military exercises. That can be you know, the exchange of officer students from different military academies. There is also a very you know, there's promising research done into confidence building measures as they relate to transparency. That can definitely help reduce tensions. You know, there's the UN Register for Conventional Arms, there's the UN Report on Military Expenditures, there's the Arms Trade Treaty, all of these international instruments that's, you know, kind of open up this otherwise very secretive space surrounding weapons and military spending. So, you know, hopefully, as states participate in them, that's also that's the big hang up there. Countries actually need to participate in these exercises, otherwise it won't help anything. Hopefully, that will do something to reduce tensions. The other thing that I think would definitely help is prioritizing once again arms control. You know, during the Trump administration, we saw the end of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We saw the end of the Open Skies Treaty. We saw the end of the Iran nuclear deal. It's just to name three. It was really, you know, a dark age for arms control, and you know, luckily we were able to extend the New START Treaty, which is the strategic forces reduction treaty between Russia and the US, which puts a cap on the number of deployed nuclear warheads. So, you know, that's one promising development, but I think especially as emerging technologies become more advanced, as they're integrated into military doctrines, you know, it's really vital that governments realize that all of our security is interconnected, and we need to figure out together how these you know, new technologies can be regulated, and how we can bring arms control back into the 21st century. That really has to be the focus moving forward.
Great. Thank you all for those really insightful and detailed answers to those questions. We'll go ahead and close out the roundtable on this last question. Just try to reserve your answers to 1 to 2 minutes so we can leave as much time for the Q&A as possible. So the Institute is a youth-led think tank, and part of the inspiration for this event is that as youth, we will be inheriting apparently this world of problems, and yet we're often told that, well, your time will come, it will happen, you'll have to deal with this. And yet I think we all wonder, what exactly are we supposed to do? And I wonder if you guys have given any thought to what role do the youth play in this kind of burgeoning security agenda, or what role do you think they should play? And Alexandra, if we could start with you.
Sure, if you want to hear my voice 2 times in a row, that's fine. I think it was best put by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg when he opened the NATO Youth Summit. I believe it was in 2020. He said that young people have the greatest stake in our future, and when he was talking about that, he was referring to NATO's future, but it's not even limited to NATO's future or even Europe's future. It really applies globally. So, everything that we've heard today about the advancements of military technologies, about changing doctrines, about climate change, about natural resources, it'll be the younger generations who have to deal with those issues, with this new reality the longest. The other thing that comes to mind is that younger generations are actually disproportionately affected by conflict. They'll be the ones who serve in the armed forces. They'll be the ones who are conscripted. They'll be the ones, whose education is disrupted by war. They can have their economic prospects destroyed in the aftermath, especially if reconstruction is slow. So it's really, really, really crucial that young people take an interest in matters of security. And by that, I don't only mean, the hard security that I deal with, but all aspects of it. So, to anyone here who's still in college, even if this is not your focus, take a class or 2 on water security, on nuclear non-proliferation, on European defense, anything. It's so crucial to build awareness and understanding of these topics. That's really the first step. And maybe just one more thing to mention, what I think is really great and is a really promising development is that there are more and more opportunities for young people to make their voices heard when it comes to security, right? It's a shame that we didn't have Tanya at this panel. She could have spoken endlessly about this. But the 2030 NATO Young Leaders Program, it's really a great initiative to bring young people to the table and ensure meaningful youth participation in all of these debates. It's not always the case. Sometimes there are also these initiatives that kind of just pay lip service to youth engagement. You'll round up a couple of young scholars, young professionals. You'll have them give a couple of recommendations. You put them in a report. That report gets put on the bookshelf somewhere and never ever touched again. Right? That's not what we want to see. We want to see that young people can put forth their ideas and their suggestions, and that those suggestions will then make it onto the political agenda, that they're talked about by those in power and that they're acted on. So I think that's really what I define as meaningful participation, and not kind of just youth engagement for youth engagement's sake, to kind of tick that box. We're going to have to deal with all of these issues the longest. Our parents could well be dead by the time that the first lethal autonomous weapons gets used. So it's really on us to make sure that we shape a world where we feel secure and that we want to live in.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Emma now. Same question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that climate issues are a kind of an arena where the youth is already sort of leading the discussion, and they are very active and I think most of the time also very aware of the sort of implications that climate change has on security as well. And I completely agree with Alexandra that the opportunities for young people to engage, even at relatively high levels sort of decision making, have increased. And I think that young people have also used these opportunities very innovatively, and then also created their own methods when their voices are not being heard, for example, through these sort of more civil organization activities. And actually the concern that I have is more that, because I've been in many events with these sort of young climate activists who have been saying that they actually shouldn't be doing this, and they would be quite happy to just go to like be studying at the university all day and not go to these like climate demonstrations and be talking to older decision makers about these issues. It shouldn't be their responsibility in a way, and it's really up to our generation and the generations who are still even more in power at the moment to sort of make the kinds of decisions that enable young people to have a world in which they can still sort of sustainably and comfortably live by the time that we are gone. But of course, I don't want to tell anyone that they shouldn't be active, and I think that it's great that the young people already are. But we do also have to remember that it's not just that we can leave the world as a mess to the younger generations either.
Thank you very much. And we'll end with Håkan.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think I said this in the beginning, that sustainable development is very much also an intergenerational issue. I has very much been forgotten. I think the last maybe 5-7 years it has become much better actually, and maybe that's partly due to strong youth engagement in the climate issue. But I do remember when with the Brundtland report, for example, that came in the late 80s, and the whole sustainability development discussion in the 90s and onwards, very much made the point of sustainable development being an intergenerational issue. So that's something we really need to act on as well. So of course, future generations, they have if we talk about water, of course, they have also a right to clean water and to use water for productive uses, and also for healthy and resilient ecosystems. I think a bit what I can see is that the role of natural resources, it really underpins life. It really underpins social, economic development, peace, stability. But it's something that many decision makers are not really seeing. And I think here I can see a role for youth groups to really advocate for more sustainable development of natural resources. I think also making it more visible, these links between climate, natural resources to geopolitical processes, for example, and kind of how it can play out when it comes to social and economic development. I think also it's sometimes it's not easy to kind of how to engage with youth and youth movements, organizations. Actually, as an organization, my organization CV, we have youth engagement as one of our cross-cutting topics, actually. So it's something we are really supposed to work on. So for example, we have something called the Stockholm World Water Week, a big annual event with almost 4,000 people. And there we have some really good segments, more like for young researchers. So that's it's also an issue when are you young and when are you not young anymore, you know, or like youth. So at least when it comes to researchers, we draw the line at 35. So over that limit, you're like an old guy. We also have something called the Junior Water Prize. So this is more targeting people at high school, kind of when they're around 18, that age, and where they then can compete in there. So we have a number of countries linked to this prize, and whether they compete nationally, and the winners will then go to the international competition. So I think this is also one way on how one can reach out to young people. I think in this case, it's more on research in different ways, but of course also young people are the leaders for the future. So I think that can be very well invested. But I would also like to throw the questions back at you a bit, because we are also struggling a bit as an organization, how we can more meaningfully engage with youth groups. Sometimes we have challenges on okay, who should we engage with? I mean, also youth, it's far from being a homogeneous group. There are also many different views out there, you know. So who to engage with, for what, when, etc. So I think maybe from you and what you would see as how could we improve our work on engaging with youth?
Well, if you wouldn't mind the shameless act of self-promotion here, I mean, attending the events like these is certainly helpful for us. And so we do appreciate you kind of letting your time for this. The Institute, I know, has a series of projects, another act of self-promotion, although not of myself, speaking to the topic that Emma raised regards to the climate implications of Ukraine. For example, one of our editors and the, I think, Environment and Sustainability Desk Officer, Martina, published an article on our special issue of the magazine discussing particularly the climate implications. So I know there's several youth out there that I think are interested in these sorts of issues, and attending these events is certainly kind of the first step. And yeah, we try to explore as many as possible. I think Philippe might have something to add on this.
I just want to add, I mean, one of the things, I think everyone's interested in getting involved in it. I would say the youth are very scared of technicalities. When we try and get involved in many of these debates, when it comes to security or water sustainability, we feel like we have to read 50 or 60 PhD or, you know, peer-reviewed papers, or we go to, I've been to many, for example, of these sort of summits, and you have panelists speaking on there about, you know, oh, and yeah, I don't know, Damro 2002, if you don't know it by heart, you know, why are you even here? And it can get quite overwhelming, I would say. So I think breaking these topics down is one of the things that we try and do quite a lot. And I think organizations could do better, is, you know, we are youth, we're not dumb, but we haven't had the amount of time, I think, to get into these discussions as others could. So I'd say that that's a very simple thing. And it starts from the very top, you know, from the words we use in our, in the invitations, to, you know, how it's marketed. I mean, that's an obvious one. Communication is a big one too. And also maybe making it as clear that, you know, these are going to affect your generation as much as ours. And much like, I mean, Addy's question, these things affect you now and you have an influence now. It's not just wait until you're older. So that's all I would add to it. But I'm sure others might have opinions on them too.
Right, thank you, Philippe. And actually with that allows us to transition quite smoothly to our Q&A with a little bit more audience interaction. So I'll give the way to Ollie here for that.
Thank you. I mean, that's a really good way to start segueing into the Q&A, because that's already including people, although it's the German, Philippe, still counts. So yes, thank you, Addy. Time is running quite short, so we're going to try and get this done in about 15 minutes or so. If you guys need to shoot off about past, because that was the scheduled end time, please let me know. But yeah, so 10-15 minutes and we'll be done. So we've got a few questions already sent in, which I'll kick things off with, but please drop a question in the chat. If you've got a question for any of the panel, just write it down there and we'll get that integrated into the discussion. Now they're not on the call, but I'll get the ball rolling with a question from Ramyana Markova about the current and potential cybersecurity threats we are dealing with. Now I think, Emma, if this is okay, I'll ask you this one first. How do the current events in Ukraine change the European Green Deal strategy, and what steps could we take to mitigate the impact this war has on our ability to counter climate change? Emma, if you'd like to have a go at that one. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think that in a way the latest attack has both accelerated the need, or like really underlined the need to move really fast with the European Green Deal, and that can, I mean, it's obviously a good thing, because now it's increasingly clear that we do have to make these changes, and we have to make them very fast, and we have to actually prioritize this issue quite a lot. Of course, there is also the sort of possibility or potential that we will now just sort of rush into solutions that are not actually very good in the long term, just in order to sort of liberate ourselves from Russian oil and gas, which could include just adding the use of fossil fuels-based energy sort of temporarily. And I would say that even temporarily, that would be okay if we for 1 year exceed the previous sort of emissions cuts or the limits a little bit, in order to replace the energy that we are importing from Russia at the moment. I would say that that's fine, as long as that doesn't create this sort of more long-term path dependency, in a way where we start to again invest on fossil fuel-based solutions. So we have to somehow find this balance between utilizing the sustainable solutions, which of course are not available immediately, and still sort of making the transition fast enough in order to really sort of help us in this situation. But in general, I would say that this new situation just clearly underlines the need to move on with the transition.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that. Gavin, thank you for your question. That is noted. That'll be coming up for the next question I had planned from one of the written in, so bear with me. Moving on from that one, building off of that topic, I was going to come to Alexandra. Building on the Ukraine theme, is fighting war and fighting climate change compatible when done at the same time? And how do you see that in the lens of what's going on in Ukraine right now?
So in the field of military spending, there is this what is called the opportunity cost debate, right? Every single euro or every single dollar that you spend on a tank or on a combat aircraft is a euro or a dollar you're not spending on climate mitigation, on climate adaptation. So in the past, this kind of argument has been used in order to promote this idea of military spending reduction, which is also anchored in the UN Charter, Article 26. So I guess that's kind of like one way to relate warfighting on the one hand and climate security on the other. But you know, as Emma you point out, now that we're really seeing the ramifications of our dependence on Russian fossil fuels, I think it's creating a sense of urgency for green energy sources to move away from Russian oil and gas, you know, to make that a priority. What's also really interesting, you know, in the same breath that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced the 100 billion euro investment into military procurement, he also talked about building 2 LNG terminals in order to be able to, sorry, I should explain, LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. In the north of Germany, where we have the coastline, in order to be able to receive shipments of LNG and decrease the dependence on Russian gas. So, you know, I think now, you know, the thinking is that these strategies, both on the one hand dealing with the hard security implications of the war in Ukraine, and dealing with the dependence on Russian oil and gas, which, you know, can have implications for for climate security, if we actually manage to invest the money in green in green technologies, it's now being thought of in a more integrated way, I want to say. So a lot in that regard has been happening over the past 4 weeks. So hopefully that's that kind of sheds light on the link. But feel free to ask me to clarify on any of that.
Definitely. Time is very short, as I just said, so we'll go on to get some more questions in to get as many people involved as we can. But thank you for that. Any more questions? Keep them coming in the chat. Now, Mariglen, who was in the chat, but I think he's had to leave, asks about how we could integrate security preparedness into the school curriculum. Now, Håkan, if you're okay, I'm going to throw you another question as well, just to get 2 down quickly so we can get 3 more questions if possible. So to that question on how we educate about these things, I suppose you can approach that through the lens of climate adaptation and water governance, but more generally speaking, how do we do enough to teach our children about these threats, in your opinion? And then on to a question in the chat from Gavin. This is more about sort of governance on an international, national level, and if we should look more towards nationalizing and the role of nationalization of these commodities in this regard. So yeah, could you speak to both of those ones very, very quickly? I realize that's quite a tall order, but yeah, thank you.
Sure, I'll do my best. Yeah, I think we don't do enough when it comes to education. I think what I've seen over the years, it has become much better actually. I recall for example, when I did my PhD, my plan was to do that at Lund University, where I did my undergrad studies. But at the time, this was like late 80s, early 90s. I mean, there was basically very little on sustainable development and environment, natural resources. So it was very traditional types of kind of research, both in political science and political economy, which are kind of my topics. But hence I was able to do research elsewhere at Linköping University, where they had this more cross-disciplinary type of research, more applied style of research, and which also included environment, natural resources, water, and so forth. And I think now there's like so many different types of master courses, for example, on water governance, environment, climate. So I think that has really exploded, and I think that's been really, really great. Still, I think there is scope for looking at it even a bit more cross-cutting, how we can get issues on climate, natural resources, even more linked to politics and political economy of climate change and water, etc., and how we can get that into a curriculum. So then if I look at a little bit for younger students, I think there are probably even more gaps, I think. So I think like in high school, I think that's something that could be very much strengthened actually. But I think it's been still positive developments like the last 20-25 years. So I think that's kind of hopeful. I think then to nationalize water then, I guess, or other natural resources, that's really like a contentious issue, I think. I think in many cases, the state or the government is already like the custodian of water. So, and in a sense, who can own the water? What you own is the right to use water, and then water will kind of circulate through the hydrological cycle and through nature, through societies, etc. So I think in that sense, I don't really see a nationalization as such necessarily. what I do see is that you need to do much more when it comes to regulation. So I think there governments need to be much stricter on, I think, both water quality regulation, but also looking at water licensing, water permits. So that's really how you can regulate the actual outtake, the abstraction of water. So I think there's a lot of things to be done. And typically where regulatory frameworks for water resources is very weak, including in Europe. It's a very weak and fragmented type of legislation we have. So there are lots of things that could be done there. Yeah, I just stop there. Thanks.
Just to follow up on that, would you say that nationalizing would be one of the easiest ways to make this regulation happen you speak of? Because maybe you don't have to go all the way on nationalizing, but would that not be a good way to sort of galvanize that process?
Not really. I don't think so, because there's a lot of also privatized uses of water. You also, in developing countries, you have a lot of customary water rights, for example. So I wouldn't see that the government would be in a good position to actually be able to manage this nationalized water. It could even make the situation worse, actually. Then, of course, the government has a very critical role to be played when it comes to legislation and regulations, for example. And I think also deciding on certain allocations between sectors. So I think their governments are key when it comes to setting principles for how water should be shared and the kind of priority uses. Typically, drinking water always has priority, and just water for health and for humans. Then it can be a little bit different, but then it's water for industry, water for agriculture, and so forth. So, but I wouldn't see nationalization as a way of going forward. Actually, what we can see where governments have made these huge irrigation schemes, very much a command control type of style of management. This is something we've seen in Iraq in the past. It hasn't worked. It's an extremely inefficient system, leading to lots of environmental problems.
Great, thank you very much for that. Philippe, shameless plug, do you want to ask a question?
Sure, it's a very small question to kind of all three of you, related to kind of the balance between the powers that national governments have right now and that international organizations have. So just in terms of sort of, again, the governance scene, and a lot of this has been about governance. National governments at their basis, of course, are the ones running everything. But do you believe that there's been enough of a role for international organizations, not just, of course, the UN, but also international NGOs too, who also manage some of this? So I take, for example, when it comes to arms control, lots of this has been done on a bilateral basis. International organizations have been sidelined in some cases, necessarily the OSCE is sometimes involved. In sustainable development, obviously the UN is incredibly active in the SDGs, but also highly limited in how effective it is in actually pushing governments to do what they say they were going to do. And in water rights as well, myriad of international organizations dealing with water, but at the end of the day, governments deal with what's in their territory in terms of the water rights. So just a small comment on the balance of power between IOs, INGOs and national governments, and whether you think that's changing or not. So perhaps I might want to start with Alexandra here, just because but my own experience is more on the arms control, is what I'm mostly aware of, but I'd love to go to all three of you.
Sure. Yeah, very, very interesting question. And, for much of the world and for much of our history, national security, national defense was seen as a responsibility and purview of national capitals. So, kind of delegating some responsibility to that, be it to a supranational organization like the European Union, be it to an alliance like NATO, be it to the UN Security Council. That's that's a development that we've seen over the past couple of decades. But the competence still lies more on the side of national governments. So if we look at the UN Security Council, technically speaking, with the UN Charter, it has its primary responsibility is to the maintenance of international peace and security. It has the power to to impose sanctions. It has the power to authorize the use of force. It has the power to deploy peacekeeping missions. But unfortunately, because of the gridlock that we see all too often between the permanent 5 members, Ukraine being the most recent example, but the council was gridlocked on Syria for many years. The Security Council has kind of I don't want to paint too bleak of a picture, but it's kind of lost some of its role when it comes to international security. When it comes specifically to arms control, I agree with you. International organizations have not been involved enough. I will say, there was a seat for the European Union at the negotiations for the Iran nuclear deal. So that's one promising development. But it's been mostly done on a bilateral basis. The New START treaty being the first and foremost example. That's between Russia and the US. China is not even involved, despite China's growing nuclear arsenal. None of the other nuclear powers are involved. So there is definitely work to be done in the 20th century, kind of like during the golden age of all of these treaties, be it the Chemical Weapons Convention, be it the Biological Weapons Convention, be it the Montreal Treaty for to ban anti-personnel mines. Like, that was really when the UN was involved and when its role was also appreciated, I think. And unfortunately, that hasn't quite made it into the 21st century. We do see one example with the group of government experts in Geneva who are trying to come up with a regime to control the use of lethal autonomous weapons. But even then, those talks have not been quite as fruitful as you would have wished, particularly because during the time that they were debating, the technology itself has made major advancements. So, even though there is this need for multilateral cooperation, because our security is inherently interconnected. When you open it up in these international forums, you also give so-called spoiler states the opportunity to kind of sabotage the entire process. So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles. If there is an opportunity to promote arms control with just a couple of relevant countries, take it, right? But if there's an opportunity to broaden it, to make it more multilateral, that's also great. You kind of just, it's a case-by-case basis, whatever works. So that's my somewhat jumbled answer to that.
Thank you very much. A lot of these, I think, you can also apply to environmental security, and not just in terms of environmental governance. I'd say the UN, for example, is one of the organizations in right now when it comes to discussing at least sustainable development, but maybe not environmental security. So maybe Emma, on your belief in this, because I think when it comes to environmental security, there's not a huge amount of organizations that necessarily claim ownership or try to. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think from the point of view of environmental or climate security, I think actually both the sort of national governments and international organizations have a lot to gain. To some extent, it has been the international organizations that have been more active on climate security and environmental security in general. So, for example, the UN has been quite active in the recent years, and the OSCE has been a kind of a pioneer, so they were quite active already in the early 2000s, and then maybe there was a bit of a like a slow period on that topic, but now it's coming back again. Whereas then national governments, of course, there have been some that have been quite active on the topic, but not to the same extent and not as widely. And of course, some governments like Germany and Sweden have quite prominently also been the ones taking the climate agenda, for example, to the UN. And I do think that the climate security is one area where you kind of need to have a cooperation between the two, because the threats are so global. Of course, that goes to many threats, but still, that you need to have the international sort of framework, but then you also do need some activities at the national level. And also because I do think that when national governments consider climate security or environmental security, they do tend to take a bit of this sort of national security approach still, and that can lead to these sort of not always productive solutions where you're actually like sort of defending your own country from something rather than sort of increasing security for everyone. Whereas then it's kind of by definition what international organizations tend to be at least trying to do, to sort of consider these things from a more international and global point of view. So I think it's at the moment there maybe is a good balance between the international organizations and national governments, and perhaps there could be a bit more sort of government level activity. But yeah, it remains to be seen how it develops.
A very tiny follow-up. Would you want an ICSO, International Climate Security Organization, that governments could sign up to?
Not necessarily, though. No, I mean, it's in a way I see the potential for that, but at the same time, I do think that these topics are so integrated into everything that it might actually be better to sort of solve them at the level of these different sectoral questions, for example, rather than having an isolated sort of separate organization.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Emma. And last but again, by no means least, Håkan. When it comes to water governance, internationally always controversial. We have various organizations, both legally and policy-wise, dealing with it. How do you see the balance?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think looking at the international water governance architecture, it's just like a mere reflection on water and how it looks in many countries. It's extremely fragmented. So typically you wouldn't have, like you having for climate, for example, you have a very dedicated international process, you know, under the auspices of the UN system. In the UN, you have something called UN Water. That's kind of a bit the higher level policy coordination mechanism, and they're also in charge of SDG monitoring when it comes to number 6 there on water and sanitation for all. So, and I think there's been a lot of debates. Well, should there be a dedicated convention on water itself? Now there is a convention on water as human right, of course, which is more limited. There is also the Convention on International River Courses that was ratified, is it some 6, 7, 8 years ago now, I think. There was kind of the sufficient number of countries ratifying that one. So it's kind of entered into force, but that was also a very, very long process. So my feeling there is there are like a lot of kind of vacuums there when it comes to institutions, and it's very fragmented. There are some close to 30 UN agencies working on water in different ways. FAO, UNEP, UNESCO, UNICEF, WHO, you name it, you know. So it's extremely difficult to coordinate. So typically there's also this debate, should there then be like one dedicated agency for water? Should there be like one convention? And I think personally, maybe that's not the way to go. It's just a matter on how you can coordinate even more, I think. Maybe having one dedicated agency will not suffice in any case. I think this fragmentation and kind of these institutional vacuums, it's really also been exploited by some of these INGOs, international NGOs, and I think for most of the part for good. I think so. I know, for example, the like WWF, they were quite instrumental in getting some countries to ratify this convention on international river courses. So that was something they really did dedicated work on for a few years. So that instrument could enter into force. The past 20-25 years, I mean, there's been so many new NGOs cropping up, so many new international networks. Also the World Bank, together with the UNDP, they created something called the Global Water Partnership in the mid-90s, and which was this more intergovernmental setup, but they almost operate like an international NGO, kind of how they operate and kind of their outlook in a sense. So that was also since there was this gap in the UN system, and also looking at international financing institutions. So they saw a need for actually creating some of these organizations. I would say that these international NGOs, I think they've been quite useful when it comes to shifting and kind of agenda and for agenda setting. So water is still typically a bit very technical. It's still very much engineering driven. But I think that many of these new NGOs, they have been driving the agenda more towards socioeconomic issue, more towards inclusiveness in decision making, for example. I think also water as a human right. I know a lot of organizations that were very active there, including my own organization, for example. Also, when it comes to integrated approaches, catchment-based approaches. So these are things that really has had strong proponents among many NGOs, and I think which very much have influenced quite a lot of governments around the world too. I think then looking more specifically at some of these, this work that more relates directly to security aspects. So I know the concept of hydro diplomacy or water diplomacy, for example. This is something that is really also being pushed by some NGOs and some more research-based institutes. For example, then looking at going actually beyond the sharing of water resources as such. So how can we share the benefits of water between countries, benefits such as energy, food, etc. So how do you create these systems? And hence you need then to negotiate much more broadly. So you really need to work across sectors there, and you also need to work with diplomats, especially when it comes to these very contentious basins like the Euphrates Tigris, the Nile, for example, Brahmaputra, Indus, just to mention a few. So I think there you really need to think so much beyond water in itself if you are to make advances on more basin-wide cooperation there. I think typically some of the countries that have the upper hand there, they prefer more bilateral agreements that serves their purposes much better. But I think there still the international community, including the international NGOs, UN system, I think is very much in favor more of a multilateral approach there. But of course, that's some countries don't want to go there.
Thank you very much. Well, that's why we don't have an ICSO. The UN has stolen the acronym for their water organizations.
Yeah.
Ollie, back over to you.
Thank you. No, thank you, Philippe. Now, I just had one question to round this off completely. And this is actually for me. I'm going to abuse my power as moderator to ask a question to the panel. Given the time, if you could please try and make it like a punchy 2-sentence question, I'd be very grateful. 2-sentence answer to my question, rather. I'd be very grateful. But yeah, so we've talked a lot about the issues with these topics. So we're talking about fragmentation within governance from you, Håkan. We've spoken about doom and gloom around war. There was something about lethal autonomous weapons, which isn't particularly heartwarming of a topic. So my question to round this off with, and as I said, 2 sentences, are you hopeful that we will ever manage to overcome these next-gen security threats? I'll give that one to Emma. 2 sentences, please.
Thank you. Well, no, I tend to be a pessimist, so by nature, I'm not necessarily hopeful, but I would say that one has to be. I mean, I do think that we have learned some lessons from the pandemic, for example, and we are increasingly able to deal with this idea of having several crises at the same time and always sort of preparing for the next one, unfortunately. So in that sense, even though it feels maybe a bit strange to say with the way things are going around the world, but I would still say that I'm hopeful that we're getting somewhere.
I'll put you down as technically an optimist in that then.
Yeah.
We'll go to Alexandra next.
Very good question. And actually, the first thing that came to mind when you asked it was something that a professor of mine said when I was in college. It was a class on global security politics. It had many different foci. It had, there was a focus on nuclear security, war, but also, environmental security, that kind of stuff. And at the very end of the semester, in his very last lecture, he got up and he said, if you don't think that there's at least a 10% chance that this civilization won't make it until the end of the century, you haven't been paying attention. And that has stuck in my mind ever since. But the good news is that there is a 90% chance that we do make it through the next century, right? So the threats are real, and as technologies advance, my personal concern, biological warfare. If someone using CRISPR technology makes some sort of hybrid between the Omicron variant and Ebola, like, we're done for it. But that's 10% chance. The overwhelming chance goes to us figuring this out, us having robust regulation mechanisms, us prioritizing arms control, and hopefully, managing these threats.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's focus on the 90%. Håkan, are you optimistic?
Of course. I think my 2 cents are that human ingenuity, kindness, and persistence will make us overcome crisis and conflict. But of course, it may also come with certain costs, both for nature and for humanity. But I really think that we will prevail.
Great, thank you all. Philippe, I'll hand it back to you with a good, healthy dose of optimism to close off.
I feel inspired. Of course, by your genuine contributions. Thank you so much for joining. It was absolutely fascinating to listen to you all, from all the various different aspects of security. This is only 3 people. I'm sure we could have had a panel of 30 and had just as many different opinions, but we've already ran over time. So I think 30 would have been a bit much maybe for this one panel. Either way, thank you very much, Håkan, Emma, and Alexandra for joining. And thank you very much to Adi and Oliver for moderating. Shout out to Krista and Kira, our events team, as well, for organizing. We've been the Institute for Greater Europe. Thank you so much for all your attention. We'll grab a small little photo as well, so put your cameras on. And otherwise, please do follow all of our wonderful events coming up. We have events every month, and we're hoping to start physical events soon, or hybrid ones. So hopefully going to see many of you in person. So thanks again. And if you want to make your best smile, we have to do this. You know, it's classic. Comms team will kill me if I don't. So come on, a few other people, pop your cameras on. Ibrahim, come on, I pay you to join. Okay, great. 3, 2, 1. Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Have an absolutely wonderful evening. Stay safe and healthy, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.